I've read a couple of pieces from you, and good evening to you, Hamish,
Good evening.
about the very real threats of nuclear war, that this is something that Vladimir Putin has in his locker and has used from his locker in the past. And you feel now is the right time to send out a warning about that.
Yes, absolutely. Good evening. It's on the nuclear front, it's a very busy time at the moment. The Swedish think tank SIPRA produced a report today detailing nuclear proliferation around the world, even in the last 12 months, with over 90 warheads being added to a list that shouldn't increase, particularly China. So I think that is something that we need to look at very carefully. But nuclear weapons actually have kept peace for the last 75 years under the auspices of mad, mutually assured destruction. However, I think what is concerning, particularly in the Ukraine scenario, firstly, Putin has threatened nuclear attack from the get-go, mainly to keep NATO out of the fight. But of course, it's actually done the opposite. And he's also threatened dirty bombs, which again has not really had a great impact in Western support. I was very struck, though, last week when the Russians blew up the dam, and I have absolutely no doubt it was the Russians who did it. It was a tactical military move to try and gain them some sort of advantage. And although I think the likelihood of Armageddon is nil, I really don't think it's going to happen. The slim possibility that Putin might try and use what's called tactical nuclear weapons. These are small. I mean, it's a bit of anathema. A small nuclear weapon still is sort of 10,000 tons of explosives. He has threatened to use those. I think it'll be very difficult for him to use them because he needs to get them in range of Ukraine, and I'm not sure that NATO would allow that. But I think the biggest threat, bearing in mind what he's just done, blowing up the dam, is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, the biggest in Europe, the second biggest in the world. The International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors who are there told us last month that the Russians had wired the reactors with explosives. We know there are a lot of Russian troops around there. And if I very cynically just put a military hat on and look at the potential military advantages of creating a nuclear accident there, it would have a similar impact to blowing up the dam. So if the offensive gains momentum, which I really think it will, I think we're in the very early stages at the moment, we must ensure that Putin does not try and create some sort of dirty bomb that he's been threatening by using a nuclear power station. And many people like me have been calling for a demilitarized zone around the power station. And if Putin has any morals at all, he would allow it. So it is the improvised nuclear weapon of potentially a power station, which I think is a real concern at the moment, that we need to try and make sure all the ways we can, this does not happen.
Yeah, and the Russians' reckless behaviour, or Putin's reckless behaviour, whether it's by design or whether it's an accident, the threat of warfare to that point is a real danger. If we look at the stage of the war that we're at, and soldiers in Kyiv have requested more German Leopard tanks. That's after Moscow said it destroyed several of them while repelling repeated attempts by Ukraine to breach Russian lines. You're a former tank commander yourself. Why are these tanks so important, and how likely is it that Germany will send more?
Well, the Western tanks, or Western military capability, has made the difference in this conflict, and the great fighting spirit of the Ukraine soldiers against what is a demoralized enemy. But these tanks vastly overmatch the Russian tanks. I think that there is so much noise on social media at the moment that I think those people who really understand this sort of thing are sort of sitting back and taking a view, because most of the Russian social media appears to be fake news propaganda. It is likely that a couple of Leopard tanks have been hit, but when you look at it, those tanks have been hit. The crews have probably not been hurt, and those tanks have been withdrawn to be repaired. Russian tanks, conversely, we see them with their turrets off and their crews dead if they're hit with tank rounds. There are also stories of mock-up wooden tanks looking like Leopards being taken out. So I think at this stage, one shouldn't jump to too many conclusions. Of course, the Ukrainians do need more modern Western tanks, and I personally believe we should give them all the Challenger 2 tanks we've got, and I hope that Germany will give them more Leopards, because these tanks, the force multiplying capability they have is significant, and the fact that they can fight so well at night in the dark, unseen, which Russians can't really do, I think will give them the advantage. And at the moment, they are just doing what we call recce by force, small probing attacks to find out where the weaknesses is. The main thrust, the main body of these Challengers and Leopards and other Western armor, has not been deployed to the battle yet. And I'm really impressed with the way the Ukrainians fight. I think they're really canny. And I think when they identify that weak spot, this torrent of Western armor should flow through and hopefully get this conflict over as soon as possible.
Hamish, just very, very briefly, I do want to ask you this before you go. We heard, according to an Insight investigation for the Sunday Times at the weekend, that the Chinese laboratory that was at the centre of the lab leak theory in terms of the coronavirus, that laboratory was working with the Chinese military on a new bioweapon. So the explanation really that China may have intended to weaponise novel lab-made viruses, that work was going on before the COVID outbreak. What's your comment on that? This is your area of specialty, of course.
Well, it's always been a great area of concern for me, the bioweapon. The creation of novel viruses and the advances in synthetic biology mean that this is not impossible at a sophisticated laboratory like Wuhan, which is there actually to provide countermeasures to protect. Because these labs are not properly regulated and policed as they should be, the chances of this sort of thing happening will occur. And we know that the Russians and potentially the Chinese do have biological weapons programs, because in a way it's a cheap nuclear weapon. We've all seen how devastating a pathogen can be with COVID. A deadly pathogen, COVID is relatively benign, but a deadly pathogen could be really dangerous. But there are things we can do. Today, the UK's biosecurity policy was published by the government, and I agree that there's a lot we can do in regulation and policing of laboratories like Wuhan. China is a member of the Permanent Five and really should come to the table on this. And all the other labs around the world that are doing, some of them nefarious activity in this area, we need to bring them under control, because I think we got away with COVID. But if a bad actor or some tyrant wants to use bioweapons to affect the world, it is possible unless we step up our defense. And any threat can be mitigated if you put the right measures in place.